Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session, which is focused on China's nuclear skepticism and the future of arms control, and to welcome Henrik Hiim and Magnus Trøan from separate institutes in Oslo, Norway. And before introducing them, let me just introduce the subject a little bit. Of course, the news of the last month about the discoveries of multiple new silos being built in China has put the China nuclear program and nuclear deterrent back into the discussion of Western experts and the US policy community. And of course, has generated a lot of interest in the laboratory. It's a reminder of the desire of US presidents for decades to get China to come to the table to talk about arms control, or at least to talk about nuclear restraint and strategic stability. And just briefly to recall for people, the Clinton administration thought it had sealed a deal in a meeting of foreign ministers to begin a nuclear discussion, but in the end that came to absolutely nothing. George W. Bush invited then Chinese leader Hu Jintao to Texas to drink margaritas. Those of you with good memories may remember a famous picture of them sitting in a bar together, drinking margaritas. Well, they struck a deal to begin a nuclear dialogue. This was the second deal struck. And that ended after Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld went to the 2nd Artillery headquarters in China, and there was a very brief return visit by the Chinese to Strategic Command, and that was that, and no dialogue ensued. The administration in which I served, the Obama administration, took a step back. We concluded that the Chinese weren't likely to want to talk about matters nuclear, but we had a shared interest in strategic stability. Maybe they'd want to talk there. President Obama proposed that. What did he get in response? No thanks, nothing, no dialogue. And at the end of 8 years of the Obama administration, there had been only one brief meeting at the joint staff level on strategic stability. The Trump administration, of course, elevated the issue. It sought to pressure and shame China to try to get it to the arms control table with the same result. And along the way, there was an unofficial track 1.5 dialogue process that played an important role, but petered out. And by mutual agreement of Beijing and Washington, that process came to an end. So we have, on the one hand, growing urgency about what's happening in China's nuclear posture and nuclear strategy, and a growing interest in getting China somehow into the arms control process. And on the other hand, just a series of dead ends in trying to engage China on these matters. Now, throughout the decades-long effort by the United States to persuade China to discuss nuclear issues and nuclear restraint, the US side has been very good about explaining what's in it for the United States if China were to come to the table. We'd feel better. We'd feel better if some dialogue were underway, if there was some possibility of future Chinese restraint, and if we could get some way to have things explained to us that now appear inexplicable. But we've not been very good about explaining to China what's in it for China to come to the arms control table. And well, as it turns out, the Chinese have had some serious, substantive discussions of their own on these questions. Their arms control strategy is not unconsidered. It's well deliberated. And their decision to abstain from arms control is perfectly understandable once you understand the logic of their case. And this is where the work that we're going to hear about today is highly valuable. Today's speakers have made a close study of China's arms control debate. They've done so in part by spending time in China and interacting with the Chinese expert community, but they've also done so in part by actually reading, by finding in China resource materials in the military journals and elsewhere that provide insights into the nature of the Chinese discussion on arms control. And they're the authors of a recent article in the Journal of Contemporary China that they're going to talk about today. It's very much my pleasure to welcome both of you to the center and to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Dr. Henrik Hiim is an associate professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, which is a part of the Norwegian Defense University College. He's a former Stanton Nuclear Fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he holds a PhD in political science from Oslo University. He also served as a guest researcher at Beijing University. He's joined by his co-author, Magnus Trøan, who's a research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, as opposed to Defense Studies. And he has a master's degree in international politics from Fudan University in Shanghai, China. Gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session. Thanks so much for making the time to do this. To review the rules of the road here, our two speakers will make roughly 20 minutes of introductory remarks each, and then I'll turn to the group for discussion. I'd like you to please raise your hands electronically and join the conversation in person, if at all possible. But if you'd prefer, send me a note in the chat function and I'll put your question into play. Gentlemen, thanks so much for making the time to do this. Thanks for this good work on this topic. Over to you, Henrik.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting us. It's a great pleasure to be here, if only virtually, and to get a chance to present this work. I'm going to share my screen, see if you all can see this. There we go, and I go into presentation mode.
Yep, that's good. We see it clearly.
Great. So the timing for this seminar, as you mentioned, is not exactly auspicious, you would say, but it's certainly well timed, because recent event does really underscore why it's important to think more about China and arms control and nuclear weapons and China in general. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this because this has been all over the news, but just to quickly recap, China is building hundreds of new missile silos in what seems to be 3 different fields. It started when researchers affiliated with the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation discovered a first field in early July, I believe, with 120 silos being built in Hiim in Gansu province in the remote part of Western China. And then less than a month later, researchers from the Federation of American Scientists found a second field being built in Hiim, Xinjiang, which is also in Western China, with something like 110 additional silos. And now, just last week, the China Aerospace Studies Institute found a probable third field. Less is known about that field yet, but if it is like the 2 others, we're talking something like maybe 360 new intercontinental missile silos. There's a lot which is still unknown about these fields, including how many missiles China will deploy, with how many warheads, but it's a major development, and it could signal a really significant concern and an expansion, I should say, of the Chinese arsenal. It also raises a lot of questions. The first question, which is being debated, is whether this means or signals a shift in Chinese nuclear strategy. Is China leaving its traditional assured retaliation strategy? it sure seems like it's adjusting how it's implementing that strategy at least, but the capabilities that it's building could potentially enable a shift in strategy too. And of course, also this development has major implications for arms control and the prospects for including China in arms control. Some have speculated that, I mean, this could be part of a ploy to develop leverage in future arms control negotiations. David Sanger from the New York Times had that theory and mentioned it in his podcast after these revelations, that China is sort of building these silos to potentially trade them away later. But we are, quite frankly, skeptical about that theory, while we can't rule out, of course, that China could trade them away at some future stage. I mean, our research sort of indicates that it's much more likely that China is expanding its arsenal for other reasons, and that the Chinese being very, very skeptical of arms control in general is driven by these other reasons for building these silos, bolstering its second strike capability, at least, not like to build bargaining chips. And even before the discovery of these fields, our research indicated that the prospects for including China in arms control, they're not very good, at least in the short to medium term. And I mean, this has not made us any more optimistic. On the contrary, it could signal sort of the start of a potential arms race or arms racing behavior by the Chinese. We should say a little bit about the our overall project in general and what motivated it. Magnus, perhaps you can say a little bit about it and what we've been doing.
Yes, hello. So for the past couple of years, we have actually been working on a larger project aimed at mapping out the Chinese nuclear debates and how these have evolved over the past decade. As part of this project, we recently published an article for the Journal of Contemporary China and on Chinese perspectives on arms control. Today's presentation actually will draw mostly on these findings. And we also later published a shorter version of this article for War on the Rocks. In addition to arms control, we are working on a larger article about Chinese nuclear strategy and Chinese threat perceptions. For this article, we are collaborating with Professor Taylor Fravel at MIT. We will actually draw a little bit on this work as well today, but it's still in the draft stage. An important element in our methodology has been to gather Chinese language materials. Now, this naturally includes official documents and statements, but what we have mainly focused on are the debates among Chinese experts. Here we draw on academic journals, newspapers, of course, mostly military ones. These are some of them are quite specialized, including some journals that focus on military developments and technology of other countries. Most of these journals are not available for consumption outside of China. So that has involved some difficulties for research on our part. We also looked at yearbooks published by the Chinese Academy for Military Sciences, as well as doctrinal texts like Zhanlue Xue, the Science of Military Strategy, which is published both by the Academy of Military Sciences and the National Defense University in different versions. Of course, there is an inherent difficulty in analyzing these kinds of materials. There's a strong tendency to toe the party line and to avoid descriptions of Chinese capabilities or clear policy recommendations, though these do occur. Nuclear debates are sensitive in any country, and even more so in China. However, by systematically reading through such materials, they do hint at debates and focal points among the community of strategists in China. Even though the intellectual climate has gotten increasingly tight over the past 10 years under Xi, nuclear policy is actually a bit of an exception in some ways. There is more debate about nuclear policy now than in the past. And it can be quite enlightening to have a discussion over the reasons and implications for this relative openness. The fact that even state-run media like Global Times can post articles calling for Chinese nuclear expansion hint at ongoing internal debates relatively high up in the Chinese leadership. While much of the material we have read seems overly cynical, it is still important to understand where they are coming from. Arms control is an effort in diplomatic negotiation, and so it's hard to envision much progress unless you understand the concerns of the counterpart and what drives their policies. We hope that the presentation today, of course, can shed some light on that. Our article on Chinese perspectives on arms control was motivated by the fact that it's a timely topic, but also that there's not been much scholarship on this over the past decade. A lot of the major contributions and findings on the subject are from the 1990s and the early 2000s, a time when China gradually became more involved in multilateral arms control processes. For example, China signed a comprehensive test ban treaty in 1996 and has not tested a nuclear weapon since, which arguably puts a real constraint on its ability to improve its nuclear arsenal through testing. However, despite China's greater support for multilateral treaties such as the CTBT or the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the consensus among researchers at the time remained that China held a very realpolitik or skeptical attitude towards arms control. Though one of the main questions we wanted to explore was how this has evolved since. If this realpolitik or skeptical notion still guided Chinese behavior today, or if there are signs of it abating. So in order to have a baseline, we began looking at the Obama period. This was a period when US-China relations were generally in a much better state than today. It's also a period when the climate for international arms control initiatives were arguably better, particularly with Obama's disarmament initiatives and developments like the New START treaty between the US and Russia. You would expect to find more optimism among Chinese observers from this period than previously. However, what we found in the Chinese debate was actually strong signs of continued skepticism. Now, to be sure, Chinese leaders paid lip service to Obama's nuclear vision and expressed support for a New START. However, some Chinese observers also noted that arms control could bring benefits to China, including easing international tensions and reducing the role of nuclear weapons in the security strategy of the US. But these were primarily discussions about arms control efforts that did not include China. Put differently, they were optimistic primarily about restrictions on other states. In addition, if you look a bit further into the debates, you see a continued strong skepticism and pessimism towards arms control as an idea. For example, a 2013 edition of Science and Military Strategy, which is an important doctrinal text, the authors describe arms control as a struggle where nuclear great powers are attempting to protect their nuclear and strategic advantages, and in which other states have to look after their own interests. Thus, while Chinese observers supported New START, they were quite cynical about the motives of Russia and particularly the US for agreeing to the treaty. Interestingly, these observers were also concerned about the arms control agenda gaining steam and the potential implications this could have for China. Some worried that there would be a greater pressure on China and other second-tier nuclear states to join in. Part of this was also a prevailing concern about US domination of the international arms control discourse. With the moral high ground, the US could undermine China's international image by finger-pointing. They were also skeptical towards US calls for China to be more transparent about its nuclear capabilities. Chinese observers are still clear in their belief that ambiguity forms an important part of deterrence, particularly for a state with a relatively small and vulnerable arsenal. So in general, observers continue to regard US initiatives as ploys to maintain superiority and limit the capabilities of others. This belief was further bolstered by the fact that the US did not appear interested in restraining capabilities that the Chinese were concerned about, such as missile defense. To put it mildly, this skepticism has not abated in recent years. With the Trump administration, Chinese sources have expressed even greater skepticism of arms control and more strident language, claiming that the US arms control efforts are merely ploys to lock in superiority. It's a trap to keep China and others in a position of inferiority. It is important to note, however, that while this skepticism really took off during the Trump era, there are no signs of it softening under Biden thus far. The hardening of Chinese perceptions must naturally be seen in the context of the overall intensification of the US-China geopolitical rivalry. But more concretely, it's a perceived shift in US nuclear policy, which appears to have triggered the more intense skepticism of arms control in China. We say perceived because obviously the extent to which US nuclear policy really underwent change under Trump and the drivers for this are still contested. Still, Chinese sources are pretty much all agree that there was a shift in US policy. This was not only perceived from the 2018 nuclear posture review, but also from an unraveling of arms control, which Chinese observers largely blame on the US under Trump. So let us first look into this latter observation in more detail. Concerning the intermediate range nuclear forces, the INF Treaty, China was obviously very critical about the demise of this treaty. Chinese observers saw US allegations of Russian cheating as attempts to shift the blame on the Russians, while cynically arguing that it was entirely logical for the US to pull out of the treaty, as it only adheres to treaties that serves its own interests and abandons those that do not. More importantly, Chinese observers saw the withdrawal as being more about China than Russia. In fairness, this does not sound too strange, considering that a crucial criticism of the treaty from the US was that it did not bind China. However, observers were likewise adamant in rejecting any calls for China to join the INF, pointing to the fact that China would have more to lose than the US and Russia, with its large arsenal of conventional ballistic missiles that would fall under INF restrictions. In the aftermath of the INF's demise, we have seen a debate in China over how US ballistic and cruise missiles deployed to East Asia would affect Chinese nuclear security. While there is some divergence in the views, Chinese observers mainly seem to argue that these could be used to target Chinese nuclear forces or supporting infrastructure, and thus constitute a counterforced threat against the Chinese nuclear arsenal. In terms of New START, China obviously has been very supportive of the recent extension under Biden. However, they remain critical of the process leading up to it, and particularly about the Trump administration's suggestion that it should be replaced with a trilateral initiative involving China. This has been flatly rejected by Chinese officials. China's response has been that the US and Russia must move first, as they remain by far the biggest nuclear powers with the largest arsenals. Chinese observers have widely criticized the idea of a trilateral mechanism and seen the suggestion as insincere and an attempt at blame shifting. They perceive this as the Trump administration merely attempting to place the blame on China for the treaty's potential demise. We should mention, though, that despite this widespread criticism of the Trump administration's policies and pessimism over arms control, some Chinese observers also perceived a bit of a silver lining during this period. In the past, as we talked about, many Chinese observers highlighted the US domination of the arms control agenda and the lament that China is not listened to, despite its more restrained nuclear policy. But during the Trump era, these observers argued that the US was squandering its perceived moral high ground and abandoning the moral hegemony. While officials bashed the US withdrawal from the INF, the JCPOA, and Open Skies, observers argued that now there was space for China to offer its own solution, and that the world would be more receptive to Chinese policy suggestions. Thus, in this period, we begin seeing the MFA and Chinese experts using phrases like Chinese solutions and Chinese wisdom for arms control. This should be seen in the context of a broader foreign policy push to improve China's discourse power internationally and to play a more central role in agenda setting over the past few years. However, we have yet to see any concrete new initiatives from the Chinese side. China continues to call for all nuclear weapon states to adopt a no first use policy, while they point to the importance of protecting existing international regimes like the NPT and the CTBT, strengthen dialogue between nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states, and regulate new technologies like space-based weapons and autonomous systems. In any event, this plays into the idea of arms control as a part of a broader struggle over image and leadership on the global arena. If the Biden administration attempts to reinvigorate arms control, Chinese observers are likely to see them in this light, not as efforts to improve stability, but to bolster or regain dominance of the agenda. The other element to increased Chinese skepticism is the perceived shift in US nuclear policy. And I think here it's appropriate for Henrik to tell us a little bit more about that.
I'm unmuted. Thanks, Magnus. Yes, the other major source of Chinese skepticism is what they perceive as a shift in US nuclear policy. And this was intensified, particularly with the nuclear posture review, the release of the nuclear posture review. First, they make this argument that the United States is lowering the threshold for nuclear use, including by putting greater emphasis on non-strategic nuclear weapons. For example, Li Bin, who's a leading arms control expert in China, indicates or says that the NPR, the post review, indicates that the US would use its nuclear weapons to respond to non-nuclear Chinese aggression. New low-yield weapons, such as the W76-2 on American submarines, Chinese analysts think these are at least partly about them, not only about Russia. You see this argument being made in China that as Chinese relative conventional military might increases, as the balance of power conventionally tilts in its favor in East Asia, the United States will put greater emphasis on low-yield options, limited nuclear options. And by the way, they also read the debates that are being had in the United States about this. Interestingly, when US scholars write about the need for limited options against China, Chinese observers see that, and they cite those pieces, and they see it as an indication of a shift in US thinking. Perhaps even more importantly, there are increasing concerns among Chinese about developments in the US strategic posture, which could affect China's second strike capability. Missile defense is a long-term concern. It's not new, but it's getting more intense. The missile defense review was read with great skepticism, obviously. The Chinese made a note of the calls for studying basing interceptors in space. And they are concerned more generally but with boost phase interception and the interest in that. They see deployment in East Asia in recent years as an indication that the US is attempting to develop this integrated network of radars and interceptors and sensors and interceptors in collaboration with its allies that is really aimed at China, not only at North Korea. And they also noted that the 2019 MDR, the Missile Defense Review, goes further in indicating that Chinese missile forces are also a threat and sort of an object of missile defense. The other main concern is conventional precision strike capabilities, US conventional precision strike capabilities. Chinese observers indicate that while nuclear counterforce, a US nuclear first strike is really unlikely, the threshold for conventional strikes may be lower. As one observer notes, conventional precision strike weapons encourage the attacker to launch first in situations where nuclear weapons are not used. In terms of these conventional precision strike capabilities, I mean, they obviously follow the conventional global prompt strike program, but they also worry about the prospect, as mentioned, of INF range missiles being deployed in East Asia. So these two I mean, capabilities also obviously need to be seen in combination. The concern on the Chinese side is the prospects of a first strike, potentially a conventional first strike by the United States, and then surviving forces being mopped up by missile defense capabilities. So in sum, the Chinese community of experts believe that their arsenal is facing a potentially greater set of threats from the US. And I mean, this obviously has an impact on arms control views and leads to greater skepticism on putting any restraints on their own capabilities. Particularly the fact that the United States doesn't appear willing to discuss the capabilities of concern to China, and missile defense is the main one, is really a great source of skepticism from Chinese strategists. Now, this issue of survivability and the threat perceptions of the Chinese sort of brings us back to the silos and the question of whether they're a bargaining chip that we talked about initially. And we think, based on what we found, again, that the extremely skeptical views of arms control in general and of the US strategic posture in China makes it much more likely that they are being built to bolster its own capabilities and ensure the survivability of or the retaliatory capability of its nuclear forces, and not as bargaining chips. Of course, the larger question is whether what they're building is about more than securing a second strike capability, whether this could lead to changes in China's strategy. That's a large question, and we may not know the answer fully yet, to be honest. But we would still argue that it's a bit too soon to say that China is really changing its traditional assured retaliation strategy. If you look at the Chinese debates, there are very few, if any, that are calling for an overall change in strategy, in the sense that they, for instance, would want China to adopt a nuclear warfighting strategy or escalate to de-escalate type of approaches. The 2020 report on Chinese military power from the DoD points to the concept of limited deterrence, which is essentially like a nuclear warfighting strategy, and it's being used by Chinese strategists. But we haven't really seen that concept being used much at all, and much less anyone calling for China to actually adopt that kind of a strategy. At the same time, we should note that Chinese nuclear policy is under greater debate than in the past. As we have mentioned earlier, people have broken with past taboos, for instance, by calling for China to develop 1,000 nuclear weapons, as the editor of the Chinese tabloid Global Times did. I mean, he's a bit of an odd figure, which is he's known for making outlandish claims and being provocative. He faced a lot of criticism in China. He got a lot of pushback. But again, just the fact that he was sort of allowed to raise this issue is interesting, and hints that, I mean, the climate for debate is changing a bit. I mean, Xi Jinping also called in March this year for China to accelerate the construction of its advanced strategic deterrent, and that indicates that there is support for, even a call for a nuclear expansion by the top leadership. And there is this worrying trend that you're seeing, that the Chinese are attaching sort of greater status to their nuclear forces. Xi, again, referred to the strategic rocket forces as a strategic pillar of China's great power status. And you see this kind of language elsewhere too, that, I mean, status is tied to nuclear weapons. That's not something you used to see that much in the past. So it's a bit concerning. Also, there has been debate about a shift to a so-called launch on warning posture, where at least portions of the Chinese force would be held in a much higher state of alert, ready to be launched upon warning. So while there isn't evidence in Chinese sources, at least, for anyone calling for an overall change in strategy, there is more debate, and at least calls for bolstering the arsenal. In terms of the capabilities China is building, I would argue that they are consistent with a greater effort to secure its second strike capability. They are consistent with their assured retaliation strategy, although one which is, consists of a larger arsenal. The silos will likely increase the survivability of the Chinese arsenal. They're less vulnerable potentially to conventional strikes, which the Chinese again are concerned about. But the problem is, of course, that these capabilities it's building, they may also be consistent with other strategies, and they may enable a shift in strategy in the future. Some of them may also prove quite destabilizing. Such as a move to launch on warning could potentially be quite destabilizing. The silos does indicate that such a move to launch on warning is more likely. And capabilities such as the DF-26 theater-ranged missile, which is dual use and highly precise, gives China much more of a limited strike option, even if that may not have been the intention when they built it. And of course, if China fills all of its silos with missiles, DF-41 missiles equipped with several warheads, that could certainly enable a shift in strategy and would signify a major expansion. But we don't know yet what the Chinese will do. Fissile material may still be something of a constraint on how much it can expand its arsenal. But in any event, there is this greater uncertainty about the future trajectory of Chinese nuclear strategy. And again, the driver of this doesn't seem to be arms control, to build arms control leverage. On the contrary, it seems like this is driven by a security dilemma dynamic, which will make arms control even harder. Finally, as a bit of a side note, we should mention that the silo buildup, while it's getting the most of the attention, China is doing a lot of other things to bolster the survivability of its forces too, including some developments which maybe have sort of implications for arms control. There's been this shift in policy in recent years in China, where it's placing greater emphasis on developing advanced conventional capabilities to help bolster its second strike capability. More concretely, the Chinese are discussing how to defeat missile defense by relying on conventional capabilities. Particularly, they are discussing the importance of anti-satellite capabilities, all sorts of counter-space capabilities, kinetic and non-kinetic, because they could potentially target US early warning radars that enable missile defense, obviously. But they're also talking about conventionally armed missiles, which may target things like ground-based radars, and how these capabilities can be of assistance in overcoming missile defense. And this development is potentially troubling because it feeds into this greater security dilemma dynamic. And it underscores that the Chinese are getting even more serious in their efforts at securing their arsenal. And finally, this development indicates further how nuclear and conventional capabilities are becoming more entangled. And how this entanglement may also complicate arms control. It's difficult enough to discuss nuclear forces in isolation, and when you throw all of these conventional capabilities into the mix, things just get a lot harder. So to wrap this up, where does all of this put us? Well, to state the obvious, we think pursuing arms control with China will be severely challenging. The Chinese are extremely skeptical. They continue to see arms control as a struggle over supremacy, at least that being the motive of the US, and a struggle over political leadership and international image. It appears set to expand its arsenal to improve its retaliatory capability, and perhaps even for other purposes, and thus reluctant to agree to measures of restraint. There is this major divergence in interest. China doesn't care that much about limits on nuclear capabilities. It cares much more about other things, and particularly missile defense. And that is probably what it will ask for in any negotiations. And so far, there is little to indicate, again, that this skepticism is abating under Biden. Chinese observers we've seen recently make the claim that Biden is not fulfilling, the Biden administration is not fulfilling its obligations, or its political commitment, I should say, rather, to slow down the nuclear arms race, but rather continuing to pursue ambitious nuclear modernization plans. That's the kind of language that you're seeing. To not be all bleak, are there any bright spots? There may be some. There is still a Chinese sensitivity to image concerns, we should say. Multilateral, less ambitious efforts may still be possible. China sort of fears being excluded, and they support measures such as the P5 consultations, for example. But it's of course difficult to envision reaching any sort of ambitious agreements in those types of formats. There may be differences also in the degree of cynicism among Chinese observers. There are particularly a lot of people affiliated with the People's Liberation Army that are very skeptical and that sort of reject US arms control initiatives outright, sort of as just US hegemonism or efforts to constrain China. But some of the civilian arms control experts are more nuanced, if still quite cynical. And this indicates that there may be, some internal debates, and that people, there are some that are maybe easier to approach than others. But it's of course difficult to say who really has more sway. Confidence building measures may still be possible, efforts that which perhaps may broadly be described as arms control, but still hard. Nuclear dialogues with China could be a good place to start. Of course, there have been these track 1.5s in the past, but they were suspended back in 2019. Let's hope it's possible to restart them. Observers have also raised suggestions, in terms of confidence building measures, such as notification of ballistic missile launches, or China participating in mock New START inspections. And these may be good ideas, but politics could still get in the way. China has been very skeptical about even talking in the past, and given the current climate, even modest steps such as these could be really difficult. So overall, I think it would be a stretch to say that we're very optimistic about this. Things are likely to get worse before they get better, but we still think it's important to understand Chinese perspectives on this, where the Chinese are coming from. So yeah, I think we'll end on that not so optimistic note, and we look forward to discussing this with all of you further.